Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I want to talk with you for the next 30 minutes or so about revisions in nursing facility regulations and what that means to the consumers who are utilizing those services. I'm going to highlight some of the main protections of the newly revised nursing home regulations that were released in September of 2016, and most of the provisions went into effect at the end of November 2016. We were given multiple chances to look over the 700 pages of regulatory changes, issue comments. As a state ombudsman program, we have local ombudsmen who are affiliated with our program across the state. There are 15 different offices. Our nonprofit agency, the Nursing Home Ombudsman Agency of the Bluegrass, happens to house the state ombudsman program, which is me. I'm the leader of the program. I help guide the other ombudsman programs on systems advocacy, and I provide their training and the monitoring of their services. In a nutshell, what we do is we go out to long-term care facilities in Kentucky, that's nursing homes, personal care homes, and family care homes, and we regularly make unannounced visits to those facilities. We educate the people who live in those facilities about their rights, and probably most importantly, we work complaints that they have about their care and services. Well, 2016, I think, was known as the year of regulations. Here are a couple of quotes from some CMS statements that I thought I would share with you. We're not really for sure exactly how we're going to see these regulations look as far as compliance. We are hearing feedback from surveyors who have now, I believe they've primarily all been trained on the new survey process that was in phase 2 of the regulations. And we are hearing that they have had training on the new survey process. They are issuing some citations for some issues that were spelled out in the new regulations. You know, the regulations were written over 20 years ago, and I think that it had been 25 years since there had been any updates to the regulations. So quite a few of the updates involved current modern language, and these are the themes of what is called the long-term care final rule. Person-centered care was something that advocates and CMS focused in a lot on in the revision of the regulations. Quality of care, facility assessment, and a competency-based approach. So facilities are supposed to assess themselves now. The regulation changes were in alignment with Health and Human Services priorities. It's a comprehensive review and a modernization, as I explained, the modernization of the language. And it also helped implement some provisions that were in different pieces of legislation. The positives for nursing facility residents include expanded training requirements and a new provision that they have initial care plans developed within 48 hours of admission. The negatives include that this update, this final rule, really fell short on nursing staffing standards, and it weakens some regulations on antipsychotic drug use in long-term care. Facilities need to know themselves better, and that's evident in this regulation update. They need to know their residents and account for and allow for more diversity in their populations and a focus on each resident achieving their highest practical physical, mental, and psychosocial well-being. We are seeing a more diverse population in long-term care facilities. I think in the Southeast, about 17% of people who live in long-term care facilities now are 60 or younger. We're seeing an increase of people with psychiatric conditions in long-term care facilities. And the alignment with the Health and Human Services initiatives that I mentioned, reducing unnecessary hospitalizations, reducing incidences of healthcare-acquired infections, improving behavioral health care, and safeguarding nursing home residents from unnecessary use of medications. So these are the things that were in phase 1. And you can see that it's resident rights and facility responsibilities, abuse, assessment, transfer and discharge were the big things that we spent a lot of time focusing in on, and of course the infection program and some issues with the physical environment. So this phase was implemented in 2016. Phase 2 includes behavioral health services, quality assurance, and performance improvement, or they use the abbreviation QAPI, is what you'll hear people in long-term care talking about. Infection control, antibiotic stewardship, physical environment. An example of that are like smoking policies for the residents of these homes. And then phase 3 is to be implemented by 2019. And that includes more implementation of QAPI standards, infection control, prevention, ethics, physical environment. There's a lot of focus on whether or not facilities are going to need to redo their call bell systems, making residents have more access to those, and training for facility staff. So some greater focus on addressing residents' individual needs and preferences. Facilities need to learn more about residents, provide greater support for resident preferences, and give residents more choice and control. While there's always been admission paperwork and care planning in long-term care facilities, the revised regulation required more of an assessment process and allowed for more opportunities for a facility to learn more about those that they're caring for. For example, finding out more about someone's history, what their goals are. We know that one way to prevent unnecessary rehospitalization is to make sure that people get the right care from the first minute they're in the long-term care facility. A neighbor of mine spent some time in a long-term care facility on and off this year after 2 hospitalizations. The first time I noticed, she's been a diabetic since she was 22 years old. She's in her late 60s now. She went over 3 days without insulin when she was entered into the facility because they were choosing to use a company pharmacy, which was 80 miles away, and they didn't want to pay for transporting the medications over the weekend when she was admitted. So we didn't really see basic care planning within 48 hours of her admission. I attended her admission with her. These regulations have been fully in effect for over a year by the time she had her admission. But facilities are, regulators are taking a closer look at whether or not they're doing basic care planning within 48 hours of admission, and it's a hopeful goal. And the next piece to this one is a more comprehensive care plan. Treatment and services now need to be expanded to include things like pain management, dialysis, behavioral health care. An interesting trend that Eric Carlson from the Center of Justice and Aging pointed out to us in a training session earlier this week is that as the use of antipsychotics has gone down in long-term care facilities, they are seeing an increase in psychiatric diagnoses. So since the crackdown on antipsychotic use, we're seeing more psychiatric diagnoses. So that is concerning to us. We want residents to have true diagnoses so that their comprehensive care plans can actually meet their needs and not cause them more complications. Behavioral health services are lacking in long-term care. I challenge anybody in this room to find a geriatric mental health provider that's regularly providing services to people who live in long-term care. We just don't see it. There may be several reasons for that. I've not done a full analysis on it, but I hear people say there's really no reimbursement system for behavioral health and long-term care. It saddens me how often I interact with facilities that say, or facility representatives who say, we should not be required to care for people who have mental health issues or substance abuse issues. And we're seeing an increase in those folks in their facilities. So We're seeing a lot of poor mismanagement of young folks who have injuries due to drug overdoses. They end up in long-term care facilities. The facilities aren't prepared to meet their medical needs, their psychosocial needs. We were really saddened that the American Association of Healthcare Facility Directors paid for a doctor who ran a nursing home full of young people in California to come to Kentucky and do training. And when we drove to Bowling Green to go to the training, there was practically no one in that conference center room. It was a huge ballroom, except for about 12 ombudsmen and about 10 facility representatives. So facilities don't appear to have an interest at all in serving younger folks. We regularly provide placement counseling to families, and we hear a lot from families that have been caring for a child with a developmental disability at home their entire life. The parent now needs surgery or is unable to lift that person, and facilities turn them down saying, we don't want to have to meet the psychosocial needs of a younger person. So people with MS, people that have been in car accidents, people that have developmental disabilities, the younger folks are having a hard time getting treatment. So the final rule included some improved training provisions. Training requirements have been expanded to apply to all staff, including contractual employees and volunteers. There are mandatory topics. There has to now be training on dementia and resident abuse prevention. We have just been working on a new dementia management training where there's some handouts outside at our exhibit. We're hosting Naomi Fell, who is the founder of the validation method. She's going to travel here from, I believe, her home in Oregon to teach that method to us in November 8th. And you're all invited, anyone who would like to come. We just need you to register. So please see the flyer out front or visit our website. So we're hoping we can get a lot of nursing assistants to this training. We're trying to get nursing CEUs approved. Far too often we've dealt with staff members who don't have proper training to address the needs of the population who are suffering from dementia. As I mentioned, better protections against abuse and neglect. One of the things that was in the Affordable Care Act that I think a lot of people missed, there were actually, I think, 12 or 16 provisions that long-term care advocates have been trying to get into law for 20 years that were included in the Affordable Care Act. And one of those things is that when a person at a nursing facility suffers bodily harm, the facility would be required to report that to the state licensing agency and to also notify the police. So that was a piece that would give residents better access to the criminal justice system, and we were happy to see that folded into this final rule, and it appears that this piece of it is going to stick. We hear a lot more about facility reports to Adult Protective Services and the state licensing agency. Although I have concern that some facilities over-report, intending to flood our mailbox, Adult Protective Services mailbox and other entities' mailboxes. But right now we're taking the approach we would rather hear too much than to not hear enough about what's going on, because we want to be there to advocate that that person not only be protected, but that those state agencies that are supposed to be investigating those instances are doing a thorough job. So we work as a watchdog as to whether or not state agencies are doing their jobs as well. So at the same time, we're giving residents more access to the justice system. Many states like Kentucky are taking away access through tort reform measures, medical review panels, as one of our previous speakers mentioned, are things that put obstacles in the way of residents being able to access the judicial court system. Better protection for property. When we're doing placement counseling, I always tell families, take things that will make your mom, your dad, your aunt, your uncle comfortable, but keep in mind, don't take things that are of extreme value. If your mom has a 10-carat diamond ring, maybe think about getting a copy made of that ring. Maybe think about not taking that ring into the facility. Don't take Picasso's. Maybe take some kind of imitation art. But that's not what we're seeing going on in facilities. We're seeing people come in with 3 pairs of sweatpants and 2 sweatshirts and 4 pairs of underwear, and it's missing by the end of the week. We're seeing people like the retired hospital administrator that I worked with. She had Parkinson's, she had 5 kids, she still had a boyfriend, she was living in the long-term care facility. One thing that was very important to her was that she looked nice and smelled nice when her boyfriend came to visit. She had become incontinent, so the smelling nice part was a little bit more difficult. These children of hers were so respectful of her dignity. They always bought her whatever kind of perfume she wanted, and she had good taste. She liked the stuff that was $75, $85 a bottle. So every time a bottle would go missing, they would bring a bottle in. 2 days later, the bottle would be missing, they'd bring another bottle in. So she should have those things protected. So we were happy to see in the final rule that facilities are not allowed to ask people to waive their right to have their belongings protected in a facility. Occasionally things come missing in laundry. Occasionally another resident who has dementia may wander in and take something and move it to their room. But we most often fear that theft is occurring by employees who work in the facility, and the facility has an obligation to protect residents from that. We see increased visitation rights. Orphaned elders or residents are common. Approximately 60% of people who live in long-term care don't have anyone involved in their care. So those 40% who do have somebody involved in their care, because our families move away from Kentucky now, because people are living longer, because just all families aren't perfect, and sometimes they become estranged from each other. Sometimes our orphaned elders depend on a friend, a family member, a neighbor, someone they went to church with to come to the facility and participate in their care plans, help them express concerns that they have. And sometimes those visitors, until this provision was clarified, sometimes they were targeted for being banned from the facility because they were the complainer, and after all, they weren't family. So what right did they really have to be there? So we're hoping that this helps protect those visitors. We're hoping that residents who have friends and family members that don't work 9 to 5 and want to visit at different times of the day and night will be able to have access. And all at the same time, we work to try to balance the roommate's privacy with the resident's right to access visitors at all times. Protection against eviction. This is probably one of the things that takes the most amount of our time. And in the final rule, a decision was made that a copy of every discharge transfer notice that a facility issues is to be sent to the State Ombudsman office. I think in the first 6 or 7 months last year, we might have dealt with over 900 of these notices. So when a resident is involuntarily discharged, when they're kicked out in the middle of the night, or a facility calls their daughter on the day before Thanksgiving and says, your mother's a handful, we're not going to take care of her anymore, you need to come and get her. When those things happen, it is absolutely devastating to residents and families. It is devastating when someone who lives in a county that only has one nursing home, and the closest nursing homes are far, far away in another county. There's no public transportation. No one drives. It's absolutely devastating for that resident to be kicked out of that facility for the convenience of the staff. And those cases take a tremendous amount of time because it involves us working with legal services corporations that often represent a resident for free. It involves us working through the administrative hearings process, and it often involves us collecting a lot of evidence that the facility was not meeting the needs of the resident. So we're really happy to see that when a nursing facility now ships someone out to the hospital because they don't want to deal with their behaviors over a holiday weekend, they can't just abandon that person there. They can't just dump that person there. the regulation update says that they've got to let them back in, and then they can work on a discharge process. Limiting the ability to dump, I've talked a little bit about this. So the nursing home has to follow eviction processes, and that's an extra protection for the resident. And I believe that we are seeing administrative law judges understanding this better. We're seeing nursing home inspectors and surveyors understand this better. And that means that consumers are getting a fair shake on this issue. Prohibiting forced arbitration clause. I meant to look up the latest status on this one. It was not being implemented at the time that it was supposed to. The administration changed between the time that these regulations were promulgated and put into place and now. So this was one of the things that immediately I think ended up in court, and there was a judge reviewing its constitutionality. We know that arbitration can be useful in some situations, but the time of admission is very stressful, and there is plenty of time to choose arbitration, once an incident occurs, after someone has a problem. It doesn't have to be decided at admission. We are not attorneys, we're not doctors and nurses, we're advocates, but we will often give advice to someone who is moving into a long-term care facility to ask the facility to have a copy of the admissions contract so that you can take it home or have your attorney look at it with you. You can strike through certain sections of it that you don't agree with, and this is one of the things that we really want to encourage consumers to look at. Staffing. As I mentioned earlier, we feel that the new regulation kind of fails on staffing. There are several things that advocates have been hoping for quite a while now. We want there to be RNs in the building 24 hours a day. Right now, facilities just have to have an RN in the building for 8 hours a day. So that person is oftentimes locked up in an office doing paperwork, doing assessments that are electronically sent to CMS. We know that an RN level of nursing is the level that has the competence to deal with some of the significant changes and conditions that occur in this vulnerable population. And the scariest stories that make us support 24-hour registered nurses are those people who fall out of bed, they hit their head, they have injuries that are not noticed sometimes ever until their death or weeks later. So we really were disappointed that CMS did not more seriously consider including a 24-hour registered RN requirement. So we did get a provision in that says staff must have appropriate competencies and skills. We are really concerned about the fact that at least 90% of the care in nursing facilities is provided by nurse aides, and in Kentucky, a nurse aide has less than 100 hours of vocational training. I think the person that did my fingernails the other night at the nail salon had to have 600 in order to be able to legally do nails in Kentucky. So that's sad. And I think a lot of nurse aides are just thrown to the wolves. We get a lot of calls from nurse aides. People who call and say, I went into this profession, I didn't have a lot of choices, but I thought, hey, this would be something where I could give back to my community, where I could really help people. I could be in the helping profession with spending, not having to go to school for 4 years and getting a bachelor's degree and things like that. But I had no idea they were going to give me a couple hours of orientation and then throw me to work on the floor with 40 people I've never met before and no one to help me. So I think a lot of the issues that are going on with staffing, or when we hear that this workforce is just not out there, I have to fall back on some of the things that nurse aides call and say to us. They are put in impossible positions. Many of them are very young. We're hoping that our high school programs in Kentucky are encouraging people to consider this as a career. And we see a lot of young folks working in long-term care, and it's very discouraging to them. I was working with a district ombudsman the other day who told me that some kind of a warehouse was opening up in her area, and she said the warehouse has already advertised that they're going to pay $16.60 an hour, and you don't have to have any education. So she immediately went to the closest nursing facility and said, "Have you heard about such and such warehouse?" And they said, "Yeah." "Why do you care? Why do we care?" And she said, "They're going to be directly competing with you for your employees. You need to contact your corporation. You need to start thinking about how may you be able to retain people or get people to still consider coming into this profession and working at your facility." Well, that looks like that's all of my slides. I'm happy to take any questions from you all. I'll be here the rest of the evening. We have a booth outside, and you're welcome to call or email at any time. Thank you.